I'm Deanne from Billings Public Library. Welcome to another installment of our Throwback Thursday History Series. This week we will be looking at the early days of aviation under the big sky. The Billings Commercial Club members, like much of the country, were fascinated by the new transportation mode of powered aircraft. They helped develop a landing field on the rims, leasing a site which was then gone over with a disc cultivator and a roller. Flyers proclaimed it serviceable except for the bumpy vegetation. The club, along with the Automobile Dealers Association, organized a crew and with the loan of tractors were planning to rid the field of sagebrush and prickly pear. In addition, they planned to completely clear a 100-foot circle, outline it, and mark a large B for Billings in white painted rocks to make the field more visible from the air. In 1910, just 7 years after the Wright brothers flew in Kitty Hawk, the first attempt at powered flight in Montana took place in Billings. The commercial club contracted with aviator Eugene Ely, who brought his Curtiss biplane to town on a train. Taking off from the intersection of 6th Avenue North and North 17th Street, Ely made several attempts on Saturday, June 18th, but was thwarted by high winds. The next day, he made 2 further attempts, but never got higher than 10 feet off the ground and flew for 2 blocks. Though he had no luck in Billings, Ely came back 2 years later for more successful exhibitions in other Montana cities. He later became famous for making the first airplane takeoff from the deck of a Navy ship. Dr. Frank Bell set up his dental practice in Billings in 1903. After a bad illness 10 years later, he was advised to recuperate in a milder climate, so moved temporarily to San Diego. While there, he became interested in the Curtiss Flying School, becoming friends with owner Glenn Curtiss, and enrolled. His pilot's license was number 196 in the nation in 1913. He bought a Curtiss biplane and had it shipped to Billings, and later flew it out of his backyard at the present Billings Clinic site. Just before Memorial Day 1913, he flew an exhibition flight from Billings to Laurel and Park City and back to promote the holiday festivities. On Memorial Day itself, he flew an exhibition flight, pictured here, out of the current site of South Park, in view of a fascinated throng, most of whom were seeing an airplane in flight for the first time. Dr. Bell continued to be an avid aviator throughout his life. He also continued his dental practice in Billings through 1953, the year of the 50th anniversary of the Wright brothers' flight. Though Ely didn't make a successful Montana flight in 1910, James C. Mars, better known as Bud Mars, did. Born for adventurous stunts, he had made his first parachute leap at 16 from a hot air balloon. Sometimes called the Curtiss Daredevil, he had received the number 11 pilot's license early in 1910. He was the featured attraction at the State Fair in Helena in September 1910, where he thrilled and terrified his audience with a maneuver he called the circular dip and would descend from altitude with the engine off. He did 3 flights a day during the fair and had 3 accidents that week, which was considered about average. One was when he had to swerve to miss an overly enthusiastic spectator, and another when he clipped a fence at the end of the runway. He ended the week with a more serious crack-up on a mountainside while making an attempt to cross the Continental Divide. Bud Mars was later hailed for introducing aviation to East Asia. Though flights had already occurred in Japan and Korea, his exhibitions were the first flights seen in many other lands. He had even taken the King of Thailand up with him as a passenger for a flight in Bangkok. Cromwell Dixon was only 19 when he became the first flyer in the nation to cross the Continental Divide in 1911. After a 3-day class, he had earned his pilot's license, number 43 in the nation, and became the youngest licensed aviator in the country. He had had that license for only a month when he came to Helena. The aircraft performance in taking off and flying at higher altitudes was unexplored territory for planes of that time, and it was the goal of many flyers to be able to gain the height and negotiate the downdrafts to cross the divide. Dixon took off from the fairgrounds in Helena and flew 18 miles west to a grass field near the tiny community of Blossburg, then a station on the Northern Pacific Railroad on the west side of the mountains. Dixon used the telegraph at that railroad depot to notify the Curtiss Company in New York and the folks back at the fairgrounds in Helena of his accomplishment. He returned to his plane and flew it back to the Helena Fairgrounds. He was awarded the $10,000 purse that had been put up by regional aviation enthusiasts for that feat. The Ohio native did not get to enjoy his achievement for long. He crashed and was killed during an exhibition flight in Spokane only 2 days later. Montana Flyers erected a monument to commemorate his flight over the divide. The Cromwell-Dixon Campground is now located on the site of his landing, just west of McDonald Pass. Business leaders foresaw the practical reasons for encouraging air flight and travel in order to decrease travel times to business sites. Leasing the land for $1 a year in 1920, they hoped to make Billings a regular stopping point for aviators. Looking further ahead, they envisioned a future with mail planes and passenger travel and wanted to get Billings on the map for future transcontinental routes. The site of this airport was slightly east of the current Billings-Logan International Airport. It was called, predictably enough, the Billings Airport, with airport being two separate words. In 1927, the world watched breathlessly as Charles Lindbergh attempted to complete a nonstop solo flight from New York to Paris. Billings residents were jubilant at his success, and none more so than those who knew him 5 years previously, when he stayed in Billings for 4 months. Known locally as Slim, Lindbergh had been performing with the Barnstorming Tour in 1922, doing wing walking and parachute jumps. The tour went broke and left him stranded here in Billings. He went to work as a mechanic at a garage owned by aviation enthusiast Bob Westover. From Westover's plane, Lindbergh made several stunt jumps over Billings. Back home in the States after his trip to Paris in 1927, Lindbergh and the Spirit of St. Louis were sent around the country on a goodwill tour. He stopped in Butte and Helena and took a break in the Swan Valley by the lake that now bears his name, but his promoter had refused to let him stop in Billings. So he didn't stop. But what he did do was to fly over Billings, making several low swoops over downtown and then over the landing field to greet a crowd of well-wishers. He also dropped a message of greeting to the city, which landed on 1st Avenue North, between Broadway and North 29th Street. Earlier that day, he had sent a telegram to former boss Westover, expressing his regret that he was not permitted to stop in Billings on the tour. Though there were a few fields and landing strips around, the city saw the need for an actual municipal airport for planes to land regularly and to plan for the larger planes of the future. In 1927, the City Council raised $5,000 to establish the airport on the rims at the current location. They bought the site of the Commercial Club's field, plus an additional parcel for a total of 400 acres. Horse-drawn equipment was used to create an 1,800-foot unpaved runway. They also spent $338 to construct a small administration building of approximately 12 by 16 feet. The city airport opened on May 20th, 1928, with a celebration that included pilots from around the state. Passenger service arrived with Northwest Airlines in 1933. A new terminal opened, and North 27th was expanded up the face of the rims to reach the airport. Dick Logan came to Billings in 1899 as a boy, helping his father drive a herd of horses from Helena in a 12-day trip. Years later, as a Northwest Airlines passenger, he made the trip again in only 41 minutes. Logan later homesteaded on the Rimrocks on land that is now part of the airport facility. Once, when a plane made an emergency landing on the Commercial Club field, he and another man towed it off by roping the wheels and pulling it behind them as they rode away on horseback. When the new airport opened right next to his property, Logan was named the manager. In the early days, he would grade the runway himself with a team of horses. In winter, he would plow the snow around the strip into furrows, which kept the wind from blowing it onto the runway, keeping the Billings Airport open when many others were closed. He asked his wife Marjorie to provide lunches for hungry passengers so often that she started the first airport cafe. Logan was an active promoter of aviation and the airport, though he was never a pilot himself. Once called the friendliest man in Billings, he remained the airport's manager until shortly before his death in 1957. To honor his long service and dedication, the airport was renamed Billings Logan Field, now Billings Logan International Airport. Amelia Earhart, the first woman to make a solo flight across the Atlantic, stopped in Billings on January 29, 1933, as part of a tour by Northwest Airlines demonstrating the feasibility of transcontinental passenger flights in the winter. The stop was unscheduled, but notice was given as Earhart, the airline executives, and their crew left Bismarck. By the time they arrived in Billings, a crowd had assembled at the airport and a luncheon was provided at the Northern Hotel before they traveled on toward Portland. On that day in 1933, Earhart told a Gazette reporter that she doubted she would venture on another transoceanic flight. Of course, she did decide to try another endurance flight some 4 years later. Her plane disappeared over the Pacific in 1937 in an attempt to fly around the world. Thank you so much for watching videos from Billings Public Library. Please click subscribe to see more videos from us on all sorts of topics. If you're interested in learning more about the historical figures in this video, stop by the library for books on the history of aviation, or browse through Montana and the Sky by Frank W. Wiley in the Montana Room. Please join us next time.